Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about immigration and the attempt to enforce that in the state of California. That has led to a war of words. We talked about some of it yesterday, but I want to get into it in a little bit more detail. One, because this will help you think through the issue. It's also a great opportunity to teach a little bit about the Constitution and a recent Supreme Court decision that I think will actually affect this. And then later this hour, we're going to talk about the tariffs. And I'm going to try to give you a point counterpoint. You know, those who believe that the tariffs are a good idea, and we have posted an article by Pat Buchanan, another individual who's been on this program as well, who believes that tariffs are a good example of the swamp. He says, you know, if the president wanted to drain the swamp, tariffs are the swamp, and that's Dr. Merrill Matthews. And both those individuals have been on the program, so you have a chance to hear from people that have been on the program who come to different conclusions about tariffs. So we've got a lot to cover in this first hour today. And so if you'd like to join us, feel free to do so. 1-800-351-1212. Let me come back to something I mentioned just briefly yesterday, and that is when the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, was in California speaking to the California Peace Officers Association. He said, I understand that we have a wide variety of political opinions out there on immigration, but the law is in the books and its purposes are clear. And so then he went on to say there's no nullification. By the way, that's something we've talked about on this program before. There's no secession. Federal law is the supreme law of the land. I would invite any doubters to go to Gettysburg, to the tombs of John C. Calhoun and Abraham Lincoln. This matter has been settled. And then, of course, he singled out the Oakland mayor, who last month warned residents of an impending ICE raid. And in my commentary that is coming out, I spent some time talking about the details of that, because indeed she actually, first of all, warned the immigrant community that ICE agents would be conducting operations in the area. She also, this was interesting, warned business owners that California was a sanctuary state and that it was therefore illegal to actually assist federal immigration authorities in that way. Well, they did kind of carry out those investigations and the sweeps, and they did catch a number of immigrants, and 150 of these had prior felonies or significant or multiple misdemeanors on their records. But they also estimated that they probably missed about 850 targets of the operation, which were able to escape because the mayor tipped them off. Now, the concerns that have been raised by people that are ICE agents, or in one case, I quote in my commentary from a federal prosecutor, a former federal prosecutor, is that this puts the police in danger, puts the neighbors in danger. Because imagine if you are talking about a felon who decides not to leave, and then ICE agents show up, what's he going to do, or she going to do? Well, we know. And that could result in a firefight or something like that. And so the argument that I've made, and you maybe have heard me say this before, is that take the word immigrant out of the conversation. Would you be concerned if the mayor of a city warned felons that a police raid was about to show up at their apartment or house? And I think, of course, you would. And so this, I think, shows you why this is a concern. And so that is simply why Jeff Sessions announced that they were going to file a lawsuit primarily focusing on the laws that were passed in the state of California, which violate federal laws, but at the same time also singled out the mayor. Now, as I've pointed out in some of my commentaries before, she has been unapologetic, and again, the war of words has heated up dramatically. She says this is a good example of these racist policies, and again, I want you to be a good discerner of news and information. When a person attacks the other individual's character but doesn't respond to the argument, that's because they don't have a good argument. And so she, for example, talked about the racist policies, said, well, this is just a policy that says anybody who's a foreigner is dangerous. No, that's not what they're saying, but they are saying that some of those individuals are dangerous. But they will then talk about somebody who is just a working mother trying to raise her family. Those aren't the people that have felonies or significant misdemeanors that might pose a danger. And so the fact that they ignore that, if she'd come back and said, look, we understand that some of these people are dangerous. You know, some of these are gang members. Some of these are drug runners. Some of these have prior felonies. I have no problem with you taking those individuals. But when you are overly broad and want to sweep up so many other people, you're punishing the majority for the minority. I would still disagree with the answer, but at least that would be a fair response. That would at least be an appropriate response. But when all you do is attack Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump as being racist, one individual referred to them as white supremacists. So you can see where this is going. And then, of course, we have the governor himself, which I thought was kind of interesting because, after all, the attorney general referred to the state's policies as irrational, unfair, and unconstitutional. Okay, if I'm the governor, Governor Jerry Brown, what would I do? I would say, no, they're rational, they're fair, and I believe they're constitutional. Did he say that? No, here's what he said. This is basically going to war against the state of California. The attorney general, he goes on, and now I'm paraphrasing, says, this is just trying to act like Fox News. The first thing I thought is, what does Fox News have to do with any of this? But again, this is an attempt to attack the people. And then, of course, Jeff Sessions, when he had said to the mayor, how dare you, contrary to what you may hear from open border radicals, we're not asking California, Oakland, or anyone else to actively enforce immigration laws. Basically, what we're essentially asking, now I'm paraphrasing, is for you just not to get in the way. So what's the response from the governor? Oh, let's face it, the Trump White House is under siege. Obviously, the attorney general has found it hard just to be a normal attorney general. He's being caught up in the whirlwind of Trumpism and is initiating a reign of terror. These war of words have surfaced in large part on the other side. Maybe Jeff Sessions could have said it in a nicer way, but now when all they are doing, and I'm talking about the mayor, the state attorney general, the governor, and others, to attack the character of the administration and to then say we are piously standing up for the rights of these individuals who are here illegally, and we want to stand up for their constitutional rights. Of course, let's ask the question, how many constitutional rights do they have if they're here illegally? And especially, how many rights do they have if they've committed a felony? But nevertheless, that's the conversation that is taking place right now. So when we come back, where does this go? Because if this is a lawsuit, will California win? Or will the Justice Department, the federal government, win? Well, I think we have a clue because we've had the reverse of this under the Obama administration. Remember when Arizona passed some laws that wanted to actually implement some immigration policies, and the Obama administration sued, and the Supreme Court ruled. So we'll talk about that and also talk about, what about this idea of a supremacy clause? Should the federal government, in any case, override the states? And how so and when? We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Are boys in America broken? Many certainly are. We see them in our prisons, on the streets, in news stories about domestic abuse or even school shootings. That is why Michael Ian Black wrote an op-ed with the title, "The Boys Are Not All Right." His commentary surfaced all sorts of emotions, criticisms, and profanity from people who read what he had to say. At the outset, let me say that though I agree with much of his diagnosis, I disagree with his prescription. I don't think men need to learn from women how feminism empowered them, but let's focus first on his diagnosis. He rightly says that America's boys are broken, and that brokenness stands in contrast to its girls who are outperforming boys in school and in many areas of our society. He believes that too many boys are trapped in the same suffocating, outdated model of masculinity. So how does a boy who wants to become a man develop true masculinity that has both strength and sensitivity? This is where the Bible provides a perfect example in the person of Jesus Christ. He confronts the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. He overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple. Yet he was also kind and compassionate. The secular world tried to help men understand what it meant to be masculine by developing what came to be called the men's movement. That didn't work out so well. The Christian world gave us Promise Keepers, which provided biblical perspectives for men, but unfortunately did not continue to grow and flourish. What we need are strong and vibrant men's ministries in every church. Some are growing, others need more leadership and encouragement. And they also need to reach out to the broken boys in their community and teach them, and model for them, what biblical masculinity looks like. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Irwin Brothers Entertainment, I Can Only Imagine. Rated PG, in theaters March 16th. More information at ICanOnlyImagine.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about immigration at the moment, that's in the news, especially as you see with the growing conflict between the federal government and the state of California. And one of the phrases that the founder of Point of View, the original host of Point of View, Marlon Maddox, used to phrase was, he would say, "I'll be honest with you." Now, I tend not to use that so much because sometimes it sounds like, well, I haven't been honest with you up until now. But really what he was using as a rhetorical device to say, I really want you to understand how important this is. And if I can borrow his phrase for just a minute, I'll be honest with you. If this is not reasonably resolved, you are going to end up with something that looks like the divided states of America. I've heard a lot of people say, you know, America's going to fall apart. America's going to go through a civil war. And I go, I don't think so. There are just too many people that still believe in this country, and there's still just a need for the interconnectedness between the federal government and the state governments to work. And so this idea of secession or nullification, even though we've talked about this on the program, don't think that's really going to happen. But think about this. In the state of Arizona, when they wanted to implement some, I think, common sense laws that related to immigrants that they would be catching on the streets and in the neighborhoods, that violated what the Obama administration felt were their requirements. And so they took a case to the Supreme Court and won against Arizona and told Arizona that it could not go its own way on the issue of immigration. This time, it's reversed, because back then the progressives said, great, we want the federal government to squash any kind of state initiatives that we disagree with. Now the roles are reversed. Now the progressives in California want the federal government to let them do whatever they want, to be a sanctuary city, to be a sanctuary state, to prevent anybody from doing anything to help ICE agents, and maybe even to warn immigrants that ICE agents are coming. And if the Supreme Court or even the lower courts say, yeah, that's fine, then you just have a situation which says, oh, okay, well, when the progressives are in some kind of control, when the Democrats have the White House, then we want all sorts of rules to come down from the federal government, and we don't want the states to contradict them. But when Republicans are in the White House and Democrats are in the state legislatures, we don't want the federal government to tell us what to do. You can see the problem here. And really quickly, what would happen is that other states would say, oh, if California can change their laws about immigration, well, then we'll change our laws. Now, it'll probably happen first in states that are blue states, run primarily by Democratic governors or Democratic legislatures. I would think that some of those in red states, some that are a little more conservative, might wait a while, but they're not going to wait too long, because they're going to start saying, well, okay, if you can do that in your state, we can do this in our state. Utah says, we're tired of giving out same-sex marriage licenses. We believe in traditional marriage, so we'll no longer issue same-sex marriage license anymore. We'll no longer recognize those. And might not be something as monumental as that because of a Supreme Court decision, but they could simply say, look, 5 justices said this, but everybody else up until the time that decision came down made their own decisions about what marriage was and what marriage was not. It could be other laws having to do with things like minimum wage or various kinds of federal regulations. I mean, we could sit here for the next hour and come up with dozens, and we could, over the next couple of weeks, come up with hundreds of examples of where all of a sudden the states, using, quote, the 10th Amendment, could justify doing anything they want without any kind of federal intervention. And the reason this probably will not go so far is because of the fact that we have this Supreme Court precedent that has come down. The first article I've posted here today on our website, pointofview.net, which I encourage you to read, is by David French. And the title of it is very simple: How an Obama Administration Precedent May Doom California's Effort to Make Itself a Sanctuary State. And he says, by successfully asserting the primacy of federal law over state law before the Supreme Court, President Obama's Justice Department may have thwarted California's attempt to resist Trump's administration on immigration. And so he's pointed out that we've always had a little bit of problem with this idea of federalism. And you might remember this when you were in school. The federal government has certain enumerated powers which are delegated to the federal government, and then the rest of the powers are reserved to the states and the people. Well, if you're a conservative and liberals are in power, you don't like federalism. If you are a liberal in power and you certainly want to implement federal regulations, you're thrilled with federalism, and vice versa. If conservatives are in power, we're seeing that right now. The liberals are saying, well, we're just going to do what we want in the state of California because, after all, you're racist, you're white supremacist, fill in the blank. And so that's part of the problem. He said California progressives have been loving federalism lately. While they pushed through a number of policies specifically designed to fight the Trump administration, few have garnered more attention than the state's comprehensive statutory scheme to limit cooperation with the federal immigration authorities. The statutes don't block the federal government from enforcing laws. They do, however, limit the extent to which federal authorities can depend on California citizens and state officials to affirmatively assist in executing the federal mission. So that's federalism, right? He said, well, it's clear that the states can't nullify federal laws in the absence of conflicting federal statutes. Can't California enact immigration policies that advance their own unique state interest? And that's where David French says, well, it appears not. Ironically enough, thanks to the determined litigation effort by President Obama's Department of Justice, progressives handed the Trump administration a legal club that will likely beat down California's attempt to go its own way, a Supreme Court precedent. And yesterday, of course, Donald Trump picked up the club, and the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, picked up that club as well. And it's interesting because he says you go back to 2012, The Republicans wanted to dissent from Obama's immigration policies, and the state of Arizona in particular, facing multiple challenges from illegal immigrant population, enacted a statute that essentially created enhanced penalties for illegal immigration and granted to state officials powers to enforce the existing federal law. Well, it was, if you will, as he points out, the mirror image of what we have now in California. Arizona's statute did not conflict with federal laws. It was just different from the federal law and reflected the state's priorities. But, of course, the case went to the Supreme Court, and in June of 2012, the court struck down the key provisions of the Arizona law, and it was Justice Kennedy that wrote the opinion. And by the way, let me just point out, it was sweeping in language and scope. I don't even agree with some of the things that Justice Kennedy said, but we all know, whether we like what Justice Kennedy says or not, whether it was on things like same-sex marriage or, in this case, immigration, that essentially becomes the law of the land, because he used the idea, that is Justice Kennedy and those who were writing concurring opinions, that the federal government occupied the field of alien registration. And so as a result, the so-called field presumption, we won't get into all the technical details, basically said that then Congress, and especially the president, basically had the right to foreclose or do away with, eradicate any state regulation, even if it was parallel to the federal standards. So as a result, he points out in his opinion, that is Justice Kennedy, that Arizona may have understandable frustrations with the problems caused by illegal immigration, but the state may not pursue policies that undermine federal law. He goes on and has a quote from Justice Scalia and a number of other things. And by the way, at the end, David French, who I find myself agreeing with most of the time, actually believes that the best decision would be to really let states implement immigration law. And I don't really agree with that, because if there's one thing that is sort of a federal issue, it's how many people from other countries do we let into this country? That seems more like a federal regulation and a federal jurisdiction than anything else. But a lot of this goes back to Article 6 of the Constitution. You might pull out a Constitution sometimes. It's called the Supremacy Clause, and it establishes the Constitution. Federal laws and treaties made under that are the supreme law of the land. And so in any case where there is no actual delegated authority to the federal government, well, then states can make their own decisions, and states have different tax policies. You know, some states you have property tax and income tax. Some you have an income tax and a sales tax. Some you have a sales tax but no income tax. You have all sorts of variation. But when it comes to something that is a federal issue, and I would suggest that immigration is one of those, then the federal law is the supreme law of the land. Well, Justice Kennedy went even further and said, even Arizona having laws that parallel the federal government were unconstitutional, which is why, unless we have a really significant split decision, tells me that sooner, probably more likely later, some of those laws in California will be struck down. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Have a little bit more to say about this, but then we're going to get into tariffs. All that coming up right here on Point of View, and we'll be right back.
From Irwin Brothers Entertainment comes I Can Only Imagine. The untold true story of Mercy Me's Bart Millard and the power of redemption and forgiveness.
My dad was a monster, and I saw God transform him. I didn't think that God could do that.
I Can Only Imagine. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. In theaters March 16th. More information is available at ICanOnlyImagine.com.
When you listen to the news, do you ever feel like you're living on a different planet from those presenting the headlines? We've always known there was a subtle bias, but today, it's about as subtle as stepping off a 1,000-foot cliff. The only way to counteract that bias is with the truth. To join the Truth Team at Point of View, your support will educate and encourage potentially millions every day. Don't let lies win. Step up so that lives and our nation can be changed. Join the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our discussion. If you'd like to join our conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212, talking about immigration. And you might be thinking, well, you know, this is California. It really doesn't affect me. Well, I've said before, California is not Las Vegas. What do I mean by that? Well, you've heard the old phrase, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. First of all, that's not necessarily true, but nevertheless, I'll take it at face value. What happens in California does not stay in California, and I think I made the case for you just a minute ago that if indeed California is allowed to flaunt the federal law for whatever reason, and it illustrates to me that they don't have a good reason, when you attack the individuals raising legitimate constitutional questions and you refer to them as racist, white supremacist, people just doing the bidding of Fox News, whatever, really, that tells me, first of all, you don't have a good argument. And if the governor had said, look, this is not an irrational policy, it's a rational policy. This is not unconstitutional. It's constitutional because of federalism or the 10th Amendment or something like that. You did have at least one comment by the Attorney General in the state that sort of got into that area, but most of it was just name-calling. Shows me they don't have a very good argument. So this is why I think we need to pay attention to what is happening there. But the first article we've posted here on our website, pointofview.net, is again by David French, who says, the federal government is supreme. That goes back to Article 6 of the Constitution. But in absence of conflict with federal law, the states have considerable discretion to fashion their own policies. They are, after all, different in history, politics, government, and culture. And so I do agree with that, because what he says is the founders' vision is largely lost. Federalism has become just another constitutional means to an ideological end, primarily by the progressives, I might say, a way of accomplishing locally what you can't accomplish nationally, and this has certainly been the case. And so he says that is why the Obama administration sued Arizona, and the Trump administration is suing California. That's why the same progressives who cheered the Obama administration's Supreme Court victory in 2012 will complain bitterly if the Trump administration wins its suit in 2018. But that's why all too many conservatives who supported Arizona now want to bring down the hammer on California. And so he says, what we really need is true federalism that might temper polarization rather than kind of the fake federalism that is taking place right now, where I'm all for the federal government bringing down the hammer and enforcing something nationwide when it's a policy I like. But I'm against it when I want to be able to have my own state make its own decisions. And I think we would be a lot better off if we came back to the founders' definition of federalism, which, quite frankly, as David French points out, might say, okay, California should be allowed to have its immigration laws, but then Arizona would be allowed to have its immigration laws as well. Progressives will say, what's going on in California is fine. What happened in Arizona? No, we can't have that. And, of course, that's where you have the difficulty. And if indeed we end up with a decision that comes down by the Supreme Court that says, well, what we did in Arizona was necessary because we just had to slap them down. But what happened in California, no, they have the freedom to do that. You will have anarchy. You will have ultimately the divided states of America, I believe, because you will have two conflicting precedents, and it will be even more obvious to even people that aren't that politically astute that it all has to do with who has the power at that particular moment. So we'll see where that goes. Let's get into tariffs for just a minute. It's been in the news for some time, and I wanted to be fair. So what I did was today we posted one article by somebody who's been on the program with us before who believes that tariffs might be a good thing. That's Pat Buchanan. And then also another article written by someone who's on the program quite frequently, Dr. Merrill Matthews, who is against the idea of tariffs. So let me just kind of summarize them real quickly. Pat Buchanan says from Lincoln to William McKinley to Theodore Roosevelt, and from Warren Harding through Calvin Coolidge, the Republican Party erected the most awesome manufacturing machine the world has ever seen. And as the party of high tariffs through those 7 decades, the Republican Party was rewarded by becoming America's party. 13 Republican presidents served from 1860 to 1930, and only 2 Democrats were the exception. One was Grover Cleveland. The other was Woodrow Wilson, both elected only because the Republicans had split. So the point that Pat Buchanan is making is historically the Republican Party through the 19th century into the 20th century felt that tariffs were okay. And then, of course, gives some of the quotes that we've used before here. You've had Lindsey Graham and others telling the president to reconsider on the tariffs. The president looks like he may be reconsidering or providing some exceptions now, so it may not be as draconian as people might have suggested. But if nothing else, there is all the hue and cry about so-called trade wars, I should say. And as a result, he reminds us again that the United States relied on tariffs to convert from an agricultural economy in 1800 to the mightiest manufacturing power on earth by 1900, so in 1 century. He goes on to say that Bismarck's Germany, born in 1871, followed the U.S. example and swept past free trade Britain before World War I. And so he again says, well, do these critics, and particularly picks out Senator Jeff Flake, think that Japan rose to post-war preeminence through free trade as Tokyo kept U.S. products out while dumping cars, radios, TVs, motorcycles here to kill the industries of the nation that was defending them? And he points out that both Nixon and Reagan had to devalue the dollar to counter the predatory trade policies of Japan. And he says that since Bush 1, which would be Bush 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, we have run $12 trillion in trade deficits. And in the first decade of this century, we've lost 55,000 factories and 6 million manufacturing jobs. So again, he asks, do they not see the correlation between America's decline, China's rise, and a $4 trillion in trade surplus Beijing, that would be China, has run up at the expense of his own country? He says the hysteria that greeted Trump's idea of a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum suggests that restoring this nation's economic independence is going to be a rocky road. And then goes on to make all sorts of arguments based upon various things, like just looking at cars itself. Because he says as the price of foreign goods rose, the U.S. products would replace foreign-made products. There's nothing in the world that we cannot produce here, and if it can be made in America, it should be made in America. He says, assume a Lexus costs $50,000 in U.S., and a 20% tariff were imposed, raising the price to $60,000. What would the Japanese producers of Lexus do? Well, they could accept the loss in sales in the world's greatest market, the United States. They could cut their prices to hold the U.S. market share, or they could shift production to the United States, building their cars here and keeping their market. So the point he's making is that if indeed tariffs go up and we don't have a tariff war, some of the things we would like to have happen, that is manufacturing coming back to the United States or manufacturing coming for the first time to the United States, would be a very good positive thing. And so, again, he says we should tax foreign-made goods and use the revenue dollar for dollar to cut taxes on domestic production. The idea is not to keep foreign goods out, but to induce foreign companies to move production here. And he says we have a strategic asset no one else can match. We control access to the world's largest market on earth. That's the United States of America. And just as states charge higher tuition on out-of-state students at their top universities, he says, we should charge a price of admission for foreign producers to get into America's markets. So again, that is the argument by Pat Buchanan. We come back, I want to focus on one of the arguments against, and this comes from Dr. Merrill Matthews, which has the title, Tariffs Don't Drain the Swamp, They Are the Swamp. And so we'll get into that. And if we have time, I'll also pull a piece from George Will, who, again, is talking about the fact that the argument being made that this is for national security might be a little bit fallacious, because as you get to his third paragraph, George Will says that Cato Institute has noted that defense-related products only require about 3% and 10% of domestic steel and aluminum, respectively, or that 6 of the top 10 nations that export steel to the United States have mutual defense agreements with the United States, or that China, an actual military competitor and potential adversary, is not among the top 10. So again, some of the arguments are being made that we need to do this for our own security, and of course that is certainly not the case. A lot of great articles coming out, though, on both sides to help you think that through, and another individual that I won't read from but has certainly done some work in the last few weeks about this is an individual that has been posting all sorts of various kinds of Twitter posts. We'll talk about his comments, and we'll get some contrary views right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Pastor John Leland, a Baptist minister in Massachusetts, celebrated Thomas Jefferson's election from his pulpit by announcing that the congregation would make a giant wheel of cheese to honor the incoming president. So, on the morning of July 21, 1801, the congregation hauled pails and pails of curds drawn from 900 local cows. As they pressed the cheese, they sang hymns and gave thanks for the incoming president. In the end, the cheese wheel measured 4 feet in diameter, 13 feet in circumference, 17 inches in height, and weighed 1,235 pounds. It took months for the cheese to be hauled to Jefferson, with the accompanying Leland preaching along the way. After Jefferson received the ripening cheese, he left to attend a weekly church service held in the United States Capitol building. That same day, Jefferson wrote what would become an infamous letter. Like Leland's Republican cheesemongering congregation, the Danbury Baptists felt in the minority in Congregationalist Federalist New England. They feared the loss of religious liberty under the new president. His letter was meant to assure them, explaining that the First Amendment erected, quote, a wall of separation between church and state, unquote, meant to protect the church from the overreach of the very government that Jefferson had been elected to lead. It may be a cheesy story, but that's how a pastor and a president impacted religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention that in the next hour, we're going to be talking with June Hunt about sexual assault and sexual harassment. Going to be a very good conversation. Hope you'll join us then. But let me just finish this off real quickly as we talk about tariffs. I mentioned, of course, Pat Buchanan's column that is out and is on our website. I might mention one other individual that's been defending tariffs, sort of, and that is Fox Business host Charles Payne. He's put out a number of tweets. Let me just mention 2 or 3 that come to mind. He said, I know tariffs are bad, but it seems to be working very well for the fastest growing economies in the world. And he went on to list several nations that employ tariffs and then looked at the 10-year average growth of each. He also went on to say in another tweet, let's be clear, the EU, that is the European Union, is against tariffs when America uses or considers them, but they levy 10% on all U.S. car imports. We only have a 2.5% rate on their car imports. So, again, maybe there's a trade war coming. We will find out. But the other article I've posted to give you kind of the con, we get the pro and the con, is the whole question of whether or not this is good for the economy. This is written by our good friend Dr. Merrill Matthews, who's joined us on the round table many times. This is with the Institute for Policy Innovation, and the title of his particular commentary is Tariffs don't drain the swamp, they are the swamp. He says as presidential candidate, Donald Trump repeatedly promised to drain the swamp in Washington. It was one of the biggest applause lines. So it's remarkable that he is pushing a proposal that is the very essence of the swamp. Draining the swamp can mean different things to different people, he says, but one clear meaning is that big-moneyed special interests can buy political access and favors. That's exactly what happens with tariffs. He says companies or industries that have executives and lobbyists who can't or don't want to compete against their rivals head-to-head, they then head to Washington to complain that other companies or countries aren't playing fair. Then he says the whiners want to ensure they receive an attentive audience, and so they bring their checkbooks to make sizable campaign or PAC contributions. Dr. Merrill Matthews goes on to say it was telling that when the president surprised the country, including his staff, by announcing that he would immediately raise the tariffs on steel and aluminum, he was surrounded by rent-seeking steel and aluminum executives who want protection from their competitors. Now, I always use this as an opportunity to do some teaching, and in the first part of this hour, to try to do a little bit of teaching on the Constitution, the supremacy clause that was in Article 6 of our Constitution. Dr. Merrill Matthews talks about a very influential book, the book that really, in a sense, gave us the free market system that we have today. It was written by Adam Smith, who, by the way, was a moral philosopher, but nevertheless wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, and it came out in 1776. By the way, 1776 was a very good year, wasn't it? The Declaration of Independence, The Wealth of Nations, a number of other books we won't go into. But he quotes from Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, who say that, quote, people of the same trade seldom meet together even for merriment or diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. In other words, the idea is that if you have people getting together back in that day, those who produce meat, those who are producing produce, those who are actually selling homes or wheat or whatever it might be, they were actually getting together not to get along and find how about everybody else's business, but how they could collude in one way or another to artificially raise prices so that they could get you to pay more. And so what Dr. Merrill Matthews says is the rent seekers complain that foreign governments are subsidizing their competitors or that competitors rely on cheap labor. By the way, that is true. So they use the power of government to limit or punish their competitors and to ensure higher profits for themselves. The U.S. steel manufacturers achieve that goal. But the United States and states also engage in direct or indirect subsidization, of some companies and industries. For example, he talks about Wisconsin provided Foxconn $3 billion in tax cuts. The other day, you might remember another tax cut that used to exist for Delta in Georgia until Delta decided that they were going to no longer have a relationship with the National Rifle Association. So we see all sorts of tax benefits and tax breaks being used all the time. But let's go back to the piece here by Dr. Merrill Matthews. He says, even if one agrees that U.S.-made steel must be protected, the problem is that imposing large tariffs gives a green light to every other company or industry hoping to use government power to protect it from competition. They will now descend on Washington, checkbook in hand, and that's the swamp, or what we know as crony capitalism. What Trump should do is give his corporate tax cuts and reform some time to work. A 40% cut in the corporate rate should make steel manufacturers much more competitive. Providing a low corporate tax rate and a light regulatory touch environment, not tariffs, is the best way for governments to help challenged industries. And so, again, you have some great answers to that as well. The other part of this is if we weren't to try to protect the industry, sometimes the industries try to find some ways to actually be more effective and more efficient without the intervention of government. And one of those examples is used right now in the Wall Street Journal because they point out that in one particular case, We are talking about a development in, I think it was Austria, trying to find it real quickly, that actually was able to produce a lot more steel with a lot fewer individuals. And so this is rather dramatic. Here it is. The plant that's a 2-hour drive from Vienna needs all of 14 employees to make basically 500,000 tons or 500,000 tons of steel wire each year. The same mill in the 1960s would have needed as many as 1,000 workers to produce a similar amount, probably even of lesser quality. So because of computers, because of automation, some of those hot and dirty, frankly, dangerous jobs in and around blast furnace and all sorts of other things aren't necessary anymore. So again, when sometimes the government steps in to try to help, there aren't the market forces sometimes necessary to force, say, steel manufacturers to try some other kinds of alternatives. And as, of course, he points out, once you start giving tariff protection to steel and aluminum manufacturers, there are going to be a lot more people with checkbook in hand wanting to actually see if they can benefit from that as well. And, of course, the other part of that is it's like a seesaw or a teeter-totter. You know, if you help those who produce steel, well, they get a benefit, but then you hurt those who use steel. For example, those who produce cars, those who want to build a bridge because the cost is higher, so they will tend to use less of it. So there are all sorts of economic dislocations that oftentimes come when we let government step in and rig the game. So you have both a pro-tariff and a con-tariff article that's on our website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we're going to spend some time in the second hour today talking with June Hunt, who will be in studio with us, and we'll be talking about things like sexual assault and sexual harassment, how to stop the abuse of power. And I know that as we open up the phones, many of you are going to want to join our conversation, so we'll do that as well. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the conversations we've had today about sanctuary cities and about the immigration law or about tariffs, those are all on our website, pointofview.net. And in just a few minutes, we're going to put up some information from June Hunt about sexual assault and sexual harassment. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more. That coming up right after these important messages.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy. But by God's grace, it is happening one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.